I stayed silent for 20 years, and the day my letter was finally opened, my daughter-in-law dropped her glass before the second sentence was even read. No one noticed me at first. They were too busy watching her face drain of color, too focused on the sudden stillness that fell over the room like a heavy curtain. It was Daniel who turned to look at me, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and something much deeper, something he wasn't ready to name yet. I just sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way I had sat through hundreds of dinners in that house, listening more than speaking, watching more than reacting. The attorney cleared his throat and continued reading, his voice steady, professional, as if the words in front of him weren't quietly unraveling the illusion they had all been living inside for years. Sophia shook her head, a small, sharp movement, as though she could deny the words simply by refusing to accept them. But the truth has a way of settling in, whether you welcome it or not. I remember thinking, in that moment, how peaceful I felt. Not happy. Not vindicated. Just calm. The kind of calm that only comes after you've spent years preparing for something you hoped would never be necessary. 2 days earlier, the house had been just as quiet, but in a different way. Back then, the silence had been heavy, filled with everything no one said out loud. I had been standing in the kitchen, rinsing a plate I hadn't really used, listening to the low murmur of Daniel and Sophia's voices drifting in from the living room. They didn't lower their voices because they thought I couldn't hear. They lowered them because they no longer considered me part of the conversation. That distinction matters more than people realize. I dried the plate slowly, taking my time, because I had learned that rushing only made the silence louder. The house itself had changed over the years. It was still the same square footage, the same hardwood floors, the same wide windows that let in the afternoon sun. But it no longer felt like mine. Somewhere along the way, I had become a guest in a place I once built a life in. My name wasn't on decisions anymore. My opinions weren't asked for. Even my presence felt optional. I remember stepping into the hallway and pausing just long enough to hear Sophia say, "She won't question it. She never does." There was no cruelty in her tone. That was the unsettling part. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was certainty. Confidence. Like she was stating a fact everyone had already agreed on. Daniel didn't respond right away. And in that pause I waited. I waited for the son I raised to say something, anything, that would remind me he still saw me. But all I heard was the quiet shift of his weight, and then a soft, almost resigned, "Yeah." That single word echoed longer than any argument ever could. I didn't walk into the room. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask questions. I simply turned around, placed the dish back on the counter, and wiped my hands on a towel that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Because the truth is, I had heard versions of that sentence before. Not always spoken out loud. Sometimes it was in the way Sophia would rearrange things without telling me. Sometimes it was in how Daniel stopped asking for my advice. Sometimes it was in the empty chair at the table that used to be filled with conversation. These things don't happen all at once. They happen slowly. Quietly. Piece by piece, until one day you realize you've been erased without anyone ever having to say the words. That afternoon, I walked upstairs to my room, the one room that still felt untouched, and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was something colder. Clarity. Because I understood, finally, that silence doesn't protect you. It only delays the moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And for the first time in 20 years, I realized I wasn't staying quiet to keep the peace anymore. I was staying quiet, because I was waiting for the right moment to speak. I did not confront them that day, and that was not weakness, it was a decision I had been perfecting for years. The kind of decision that only comes when you stop hoping people will change and start seeing them exactly as they are. Because once you see clearly, you do not rush, you do not argue, you observe, and I had become very good at observing. I moved through the rest of that afternoon the same way I always did, quietly, deliberately, making dinner even though I knew they would barely touch it, setting the table for 3 out of habit even though it felt more like setting a stage than sharing a meal, and when they finally sat down across from me, I watched them the way I used to watch storms roll in through the kitchen window. Calm on the surface, but already knowing what was coming. Sophia smiled as she scrolled through her phone, that polished, effortless smile she wore like a uniform, and Daniel asked me a question about the weather, not because he cared, but because silence made him uncomfortable, and I answered him the same way I always did, politely, simply, without giving him anything more than he expected, because that was the role they had given me, predictable, quiet, harmless. I noticed the way Sophia glanced at him before speaking, the way he nodded slightly before agreeing with her, small signals that would have gone unnoticed to anyone else, but not to me, not anymore, because once you understand that everything in a family like this is a performance, you start to see the cues, the rehearsed timing, the invisible script, and I realized something as I sat there listening to them discuss plans that did not include me. They were not hiding anything anymore, not really. They had simply stopped considering me important enough to hide things from, and that realization settled over me more heavily than any argument ever could have. After dinner, I cleared the plates while they moved into the living room, their voices low again, but not low enough, never low enough, and I heard my name once, then a pause, then Sophia's voice again, softer this time. "It is better this way," she said, and Daniel did not disagree. He rarely disagreed anymore. I dried my hands slowly, the same way I had earlier, and for a moment I stood there, just listening to the rhythm of their voices, the ease between them, the certainty, and I realized that this was not new, it only felt new because I had finally stopped ignoring it. That night, I went upstairs earlier than usual, not because I was tired, but because I needed to think without the sound of their voices shaping my thoughts. My room was still the same as it had always been, the same quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the same framed photograph on the nightstand, the one from a time when Daniel still looked at me like I mattered. I sat down and picked it up, not to dwell on the past, but to remind myself of something important. That what we had once was real, and that made what it had become impossible to excuse. I set the photo back in its place and opened the drawer beneath it, the one I had kept closed for years. Inside were documents, neatly organized, untouched, waiting, because preparation does not begin the moment you decide to act. It begins long before that, in the quiet moments when you realize that someday, you might need the truth to speak for you. I ran my fingers over the edges of the papers. Not reading them, not yet, just acknowledging their presence, the weight of them, and for the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to consider what would happen if I stopped being the version of myself they had grown comfortable with, if I stopped being the woman who absorbed everything without reaction, who stayed in her place, who made things easier for everyone else. The thought did not scare me, it steadied me, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. Silence is only powerful if it leads somewhere, and mine had been leading here all along, to this moment where I no longer needed them to see me. I only needed them to finally understand what I had known for years. The next morning, the house felt quieter than usual, but it was not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind that makes every small sound feel deliberate, like the ticking of the clock in the hallway or the faint hum of the refrigerator. I woke up before sunrise as I always did, out of habit more than necessity, and for a few moments I simply sat on the edge of my bed, letting the stillness settle around me. Because mornings had become the only time of day that truly belonged to me. Untouched by conversations that excluded me or decisions that were made without me, I made my way downstairs slowly, running my hand along the banister, remembering when this house used to feel alive with voices, laughter, the kind of noise that meant you were surrounded by people who saw you, but that feeling had been replaced over the years by something quieter, something colder. Something that did not announce itself but made its presence known all the same. In the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the first light stretch across the backyard. And that was when I heard the knock at the front door. It was early, too early for visitors, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, because unexpected interruptions had a way of complicating things, but something in the persistence of the knock made me set my cup down and walk toward the door. When I opened it, I found a man standing there in a neatly pressed coat, his posture straight, his expression careful, as though he had rehearsed what he was about to say more than once. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice measured. "I hope I am not intruding." And I recognized him after a second, though it had been years. Mr. Reynolds, my late husband's attorney, the man who had once sat at our dining table and spoken about wills and protections as if they were just another part of planning for the future. I stepped aside and let him in without asking too many questions, because something about his presence told me that this was not a casual visit. We sat in the living room, the same room where Daniel and Sophia spent most of their evenings, but at that hour it felt like a different place entirely, quieter, more honest somehow. Mr. Reynolds reached into his briefcase and placed a folder on the table between us. But he did not open it right away. Instead, he looked at me for a moment, studying my face as if trying to determine how much I already knew. "Your husband trusted you very much," he said finally, and I nodded, not because I needed the reminder, but because I understood that this conversation was not just about the past. "There are things he put in place before he passed," he continued. "Protections, conditions, things that were meant to ensure you would always be taken care of." I felt a slight shift in my chest, not surprise, but confirmation, because I had always known my husband was not a man who left things to chance. "And those things," Mr. Reynolds added, his voice lowering slightly, "have not been handled the way they were intended." The room seemed to hold its breath in that moment, and I did not interrupt him. I did not ask questions, I simply waited, the way I had learned to wait, because people reveal more when you give them space. He opened the folder and turned it toward me, and although I did not read every word immediately, I recognized enough to understand what he was showing me: documents, transfers, decisions that had been made without my knowledge, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it, not as anger, but as clarity. Because what had once been a quiet suspicion was now something tangible, something undeniable. "I was not supposed to bring this to you unless it became necessary," he said, almost apologetically. "But given certain developments, I believe it is time you are fully aware." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and asked the only question that mattered. "How long?" He hesitated, just for a moment, before answering. "Longer than it should have been." And that was enough, because it confirmed what I had already known deep down, that this was not something new, not something recent, but something that had been unfolding slowly, carefully, right in front of me, and I had allowed it, not because I was blind, but because I had chosen to be patient. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it, feeling the steady calm return, because the truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a man at your door and a folder on your table, and when it does, you do not react, you prepare. After Mr. Reynolds left, the house felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because I could no longer pretend that I did not understand what had been happening inside it. I carried the folder upstairs slowly, holding it close to my chest. Not out of fear, but out of recognition, because this was no longer just a collection of papers. It was the quiet confirmation of years I had spent watching things shift around me. I sat down at the small desk by the window in my room, the same desk where I used to write birthday cards and grocery lists, and for a moment I just looked at the folder without opening it, because once you read something like that, you cannot unread it. And there is a certain kind of peace in that last second before everything becomes undeniable. But I did not stay in that moment long. I opened it carefully, page by page, letting the details settle into place. Transfers I had never approved, signatures I did not recognize, decisions that had been made in my name but without my voice. And as I read, I did not feel shock, I did not feel anger. What I felt was something steadier, something colder. The kind of understanding that does not arrive all at once but builds slowly until there is no room left for doubt. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a second, not to escape, but to remember. Because memory has a way of rearranging itself once you finally know the truth. Suddenly the past does not look the same. Moments you once dismissed as small begin to carry weight. Patterns you ignored become impossible to overlook. I thought about the first time Sophia walked into this house. How carefully she observed everything. How quickly she learned where things were. how naturally she began to adjust small details, moving things slightly, not enough to cause concern, but enough to establish a quiet control. I remembered how Daniel used to ask me about everything, even the smallest decisions, and how that gradually changed, not overnight, but slowly, until one day he was no longer asking at all. I remembered the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the decisions that were already made before I was informed, the way my role in the house shifted from participant to observer without anyone ever acknowledging it, and I realized something as I sat there holding those papers. None of this had been accidental, it had been deliberate, careful, patient, just like my silence. The difference was that I had stayed quiet to preserve something I believed in, and they had acted quietly to take something they believed I would never protect. I stood up and walked over to the mirror, studying my reflection, not out of vanity, but out of recognition, because the woman looking back at me was not the same one who had spent years accepting things without question. There was something different now, something clearer. And for the first time, I allowed myself to say it out loud. Softly, just enough to hear it. I know. The words did not echo, they did not need to, they settled into the room the same way the truth had settled into me, steady, unshakable. I placed the folder back on the desk and straightened it carefully, aligning the edges. Because even in that moment, I did not rush, I did not react impulsively. I had learned that timing matters more than emotion. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of Sophia's voice, light, controlled. The same tone she used when she wanted something to feel effortless, and Daniel responded in that quiet, agreeable way that had become second nature to him, and for a brief moment, I imagined walking down there, placing the folder on the table, and watching their expressions change in real time, but I did not move, because that would have been too easy, too immediate, and I had not waited this long to act without precision. Instead, I turned away from the door and sat back down, folding my hands together, letting the calm return fully, because now it was not just about knowing the truth, it was about deciding how that truth would be revealed, and I understood something with absolute clarity. I would not raise my voice, I would not argue, I would not explain. When the time came, I would simply let the truth speak for itself, and when it did, there would be no way for them to pretend they had not heard it. I did not go downstairs right away, even though I could hear them clearly, because I had learned that timing is not about when something happens, it is about when it matters, and for years nothing I said had truly mattered to them, so I had stopped trying to make it matter. But now that had changed, not because they were different, but because I stayed in my room and began to organize the documents carefully, not in a rushed or frantic way, but with the same steady precision I had used to manage every part of this household for decades. I sorted through each page, separating what confirmed what I already knew from what revealed something new, and with each document, the picture became clearer, more complete. Like a puzzle that had been scattered over years finally coming together in a single, undeniable image. There were signatures that had been added when I was told nothing needed my attention, transfers that had been explained away as routine, decisions framed as convenience but rooted in control, and I realized something as I traced my finger along one particular line. This had not been one moment of betrayal, it had been a series of choices, repeated again and again, until it became a system. And systems are not built overnight, they are built with confidence, with the assumption that no one will challenge them. I closed my eyes briefly and thought about all the times I had chosen silence, not because I did not notice, but because I believed there was still something worth protecting, my marriage, my family, the idea that loyalty could still exist if I held on long enough. But loyalty does not survive in silence when only one person is honoring it. I stood up and walked to the closet, opening the door slowly, and inside were boxes I had not touched in years. Old records, personal documents, things I had kept not out of sentiment, but out of habit, because I had always believed in keeping things in order. I pulled one of the boxes down and placed it on the bed, opening it carefully, and inside were papers that told a different story, one from before Sophia arrived, before the subtle shifts began, before the quiet changes that slowly erased my place in this house. I compared them side by side with what Mr. Reynolds had given me, and the contrast was undeniable. What had once been transparent had become obscured. What had once included me had gradually excluded me, and yet everything had been done in a way that allowed them to pretend it was normal, reasonable, even necessary. I let out a slow breath and closed the box, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I had seen enough. I did not need every detail to understand the truth. I only needed enough to know that what I was about to do was not an overreaction, it was a correction. Downstairs, I heard Sophia laugh softly, the sound light and effortless, the kind of laugh that suggested everything was exactly as it should be. And I wondered briefly if she truly believed that, if she had convinced herself that what she had done was justified, or if she simply did not care. Either way, it did not matter anymore, because this was no longer about understanding them, it was about deciding how I would respond. I walked back to the desk and sat down, placing both sets of documents in front of me, aligning them carefully, and for a moment I rested my hands on top of them, feeling their weight, not just the physical weight, but the years they represented, the choices, the silence, the slow erosion of something that should have been protected. And then I reached for a blank sheet of paper, not hurriedly, not with hesitation, but with intention, because words, when used at the right moment, do not need to be loud to be powerful. I picked up a pen and held it between my fingers, staring at the empty page, knowing that what I wrote would not be long, it would not need to be. Because the truth does not require explanation when it is presented clearly. I thought about everything I had seen, everything I had allowed, everything I had chosen not to confront, and I understood now that silence had given me something they did not have, perspective, and perspective gives you control. I lowered the pen to the paper and began to write, slowly, carefully, each word deliberate, each sentence measured, because this was not just a letter, it was the moment when everything they had built without me would finally have to face me. Not in anger, not in confrontation, but in truth, and truth, when it is delivered at the right time, does not need anything else. Once I began writing, I did not stop, not because there was so much to say, but because I had spent years deciding exactly what needed to be said and what did not. The letter was not emotional, it was not filled with accusations or explanations, it was precise, deliberate, the kind of clarity that does not ask for understanding, it simply presents truth and allows it to stand on its own. I wrote slowly, each sentence measured, because I understood that words, when chosen carefully, carry more weight than any raised voice ever could. I did not need to tell them how I felt, I did not need to remind them of what they had done. Everything they needed to know was already there, documented, undeniable, and all I had to do was connect the pieces in a way that left no room for interpretation. When I finished, I placed the pen down and read it once, not to change anything, but to confirm that it said exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. Then I folded the paper neatly, the same way I had folded countless letters over the years, and slipped it into an envelope, sealing it with a quiet, steady motion. There was no hesitation in that moment, no second guessing, because this was not a decision made in haste, it was the result of 20 years of watching, waiting, understanding. I wrote a single name on the front, not mine, not even theirs, but the name of the man who would ensure it was delivered at the right time, Mr. Reynolds, because timing, as I had learned, is everything. I placed the envelope on the desk beside the documents, and sat back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me once more. But this time it felt different, not heavy, not suffocating, but controlled, intentional, like the pause before something inevitable. Downstairs, I could hear the familiar rhythm of their routine, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional sound of a chair moving across the floor, the subtle signals of a life continuing exactly as they expected it to, and for the first time in years, I understood that I was no longer part of that expectation, and that realization did not hurt, it freed me. Because when people stop expecting anything from you, they stop preparing for what you might do, and that is where true control begins. I stood up and gathered the documents, placing them back into the folder. With careful precision, not rushing, not allowing even the smallest detail to feel out of place, because this was not just about revealing the truth, it was about presenting it in a way that could not be dismissed. I walked to the closet and returned the older records to their box, closing it gently and placing it back where it belonged, because the past had served its purpose, it had led me here. And now it no longer needed to be revisited. When I stepped back into the hallway, I paused for a moment, listening again to the sounds from below, and I realized something that had been building quietly within me. They believed they understood me, they believed they had defined my role, limited my influence, reduced my presence to something manageable, something predictable. But they had misunderstood one important thing. Silence is not absence, it is presence without interference, it is observation without reaction. And it gives you something that noise never can, awareness. I made my way downstairs then, not because I needed to confront them, but because I was ready to move forward as if everything was still the same, because that was part of the plan. There would be no sudden change in my behavior, no indication that anything had shifted. I entered the living room with the same calm expression I had worn for years, and Sophia looked up briefly, offering a small, polite smile before returning to her phone, while Daniel nodded in acknowledgement, already half distracted by whatever conversation they had been having, and I took my usual seat, folding my hands in my lap, listening without speaking, observing without reacting, exactly as they expected. And that was the point, because the most effective change does not announce itself, it unfolds quietly, in its own time, and by the time it is recognized, it is already complete. I sat there with them, part of the same room, part of the same routine, but no longer part of the same illusion, because I knew something they did not, something they had never considered, that everything they believed was secure, everything they had built on the assumption of my silence, was already beginning to shift. And when the moment came, it would not be loud, it would not be dramatic, it would simply be undeniable. The next day unfolded exactly as the ones before it, and that was precisely what I needed. Nothing felt rushed, nothing felt out of place, and that sameness created the perfect cover for what had already begun. I woke up at the same hour, made the same cup of coffee, and stood in the same spot by the window, watching the light move slowly across the yard as if nothing in the world had shifted, and in a way, nothing had, not yet. Because change does not happen the moment you decide it should, it happens when everything is already set in motion and no one else realizes it. I carried the envelope with me downstairs, not in a way that would draw attention, but naturally, as if it were just another piece of mail, something ordinary, something unimportant, and I placed it near the front door, resting it among the other envelopes that had arrived the day before. Blending it into the routine so completely that it became invisible, Sophia walked through the hallway shortly after, her heels making that soft, steady sound against the floor, and she barely glanced at me, offering a polite nod before picking up her phone, her attention already elsewhere, and Daniel followed not long after, adjusting his jacket, preparing for the day, moving with that same quiet efficiency he had adopted over the years, and neither of them noticed the envelope, not because it was hidden, but because they had learned not to look for anything involving me, and that, I realized, was the greatest advantage I had, not secrecy, but their certainty that there was nothing to discover. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. They left the house, their conversations trailing off as the door closed behind them, and I was alone again, standing in the quiet space that had once felt empty but now felt deliberate. I walked back to the front door and picked up the envelope, holding it for a moment, feeling its weight, not physically, but in everything it represented. Then I placed it into my bag and made my way out of the house, locking the door behind me with the same calm motion I had performed thousands of times before. The drive to Mr. Reynolds' office was familiar, the streets unchanged, the traffic predictable, and that familiarity made everything feel steady, controlled, as if I were following a path that had always been there, waiting for me to take it. When I arrived, he greeted me with the same composed professionalism, but there was something in his eyes now, something more attentive, more aware. As if he understood that this was no longer just a matter of paperwork, I handed him the envelope without explanation, and he accepted it without question, because some things do not need to be explained when both people understand their importance. "This will be delivered exactly as you intend," he said quietly, and I nodded because that was all that needed to be said. There was no need for further discussion, no need for reassurance. The plan was already in place, and all that remained was for time to do what it always does, move forward. I left his office with the same calm I had arrived with. stepping back into the afternoon light as if nothing significant had just occurred, and in many ways, nothing had, at least not visibly, because the most important changes are often the ones that cannot be seen right away. When I returned home, everything was exactly as I had left it, the same furniture, the same quiet, the same sense of normalcy that had defined this house for years, and I moved through it with ease. Continuing my routine, preparing dinner, setting the table, maintaining the same presence they had grown accustomed to, and when Daniel and Sophia returned that evening, they stepped back into that routine without hesitation, their conversation light, their movements familiar, their expectations unchanged, and I joined them in that space, sitting at the table, listening as they spoke, responding when necessary, offering nothing more than what they anticipated. Because the plan did not require me to change who I appeared to be, it required me to remain exactly as they believed I was, predictable, quiet, harmless, and as I sat there, watching them move through their evening as if everything was secure, I understood something with complete clarity. They were not preparing for what was coming, because they did not believe anything was coming at all, and that certainty, that unshakable confidence in their version of reality, was the very thing that would make what followed impossible for them to ignore. I lifted my glass slightly, taking a small sip, and allowed the silence between their words to settle, because I knew that somewhere ahead, not far, not distant, but inevitable, there would be a moment when that silence would finally speak, and when it did, there would be nothing left for them to hold on to except the truth. The call came 3 days later, and I knew what it was before I even answered, because there is a certain kind of silence that settles into a moment just before everything shifts, and I had learned to recognize it. I was sitting in the living room, the same chair I had occupied countless times before, when my phone rang, and I picked it up without hesitation. "Mrs. Collins," Mr. Reynolds' voice came through, steady, measured. "It has been arranged." And that was all he said, no details, no explanation, just confirmation, and I thanked him quietly before ending the call, placing the phone back on the table as if nothing significant had just happened, because outwardly, nothing had. The house was still the same, the afternoon light still fell across the floor in long, familiar lines, and the clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, marking time in a way that felt almost indifferent, but beneath that stillness, something had already begun, something that could not be undone. That evening, Daniel mentioned a meeting, something about paperwork, something about finalizing a few remaining details related to my late husband's estate, and his tone was casual, almost routine, as if it were just another task to complete. Sophia nodded beside him, her expression composed, her confidence unchanged, and I listened quietly, folding my hands in my lap, offering no resistance, no questions. Because this was exactly what I had expected. They believed they were in control of the situation, they believed everything was moving according to their plan, and I allowed them to believe that, because there is no advantage in correcting someone who is about to reveal everything themselves. The day of the meeting arrived without urgency, without tension, just another morning that followed the same familiar rhythm, and I prepared myself in the same quiet way I always had, choosing my clothes carefully, not for appearance, but for composure, because how you carry yourself in a moment like that matters more than anything you might say. The drive to the office was silent. Daniel focused on the road, Sophia occasionally glancing at her phone, and I sat in the back seat, watching the city pass by through the window, each building, each street corner, a reminder of how long I had been part of a life that no longer included me in the way it once had. When we arrived, everything felt orderly, professional, exactly as it should be, the kind of environment where decisions are made and documented, where words carry weight simply because they are written down. Mr. Reynolds greeted us with the same calm professionalism, but there was a subtle difference in his demeanor now, a quiet awareness that only I seemed to recognize. We were seated around the table, the documents placed neatly in front of us, and for a moment, everything felt still, as if the room itself was waiting. Daniel leaned forward slightly, ready to proceed. Sophia sat with that same composed confidence, her posture relaxed, her expression assured. And I remained exactly as I had been for years, calm, quiet, observing. Mr. Reynolds began to speak, outlining the purpose of the meeting, his tone clear, measured, and then, Without hesitation, he reached for a separate envelope, one that had not been part of the original stack, and placed it in front of him. And I saw it then, the brief flicker of uncertainty in Sophia's eyes, the slight shift in Daniel's posture, small changes, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that something was no longer aligning with their expectations. "Before we proceed," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice steady, "there is an additional document that needs to be addressed." And as he opened the envelope, I felt that same calm settle over me, not anticipation, not satisfaction, just certainty, because this was the moment. When silence would no longer be mistaken for absence, this was the moment when everything that had been assumed, everything that had been taken for granted, would finally have to stand against something real, something undeniable, and I did not move, I did not speak, I simply sat there, hands folded, watching as the truth I had carried quietly for so long began to unfold in front of them, one word at a time. Mr. Reynolds unfolded the letter with a careful, practiced motion, and the room seemed to grow quieter with every second that passed, not because anyone had asked for silence, but because something deeper had settled over us, something that demanded attention without needing to announce itself. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still, while Sophia sat straighter. Her composure intact but thinner now, more fragile, like something held together by habit rather than certainty. And then Mr. Reynolds began to read, his voice calm, steady, carrying each word with the same weight. "To whom it may concern," he started, and I watched as Sophia's eyes flickered, just for a moment, as if she recognized that this was not part of the script she had been following. The letter did not accuse, it did not explain, it simply stated facts, dates, decisions, patterns, all laid out with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. It spoke of transfers made without consent, of authority assumed without acknowledgement, of a gradual shift that had been mistaken for acceptance, and as each sentence unfolded, I could see it happening, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, the slow unraveling of everything they had believed was secure. Daniel's expression changed first, not into anger, but into something quieter, something heavier. The realization that there were pieces of his own life he had never fully examined, that what he had accepted as normal might not have been normal at all. Sophia remained still at first, her posture unchanged, her expression controlled, but there was a tightness now, a subtle strain that had not been there before, because the truth does not need to raise its voice to be heard, it only needs to be undeniable, and that is what the letter was, undeniable. Mr. Reynolds continued, his tone never shifting, never adding emphasis where it was not needed, and when he reached the final paragraph, the room felt different, as if the air itself had shifted. "Effective immediately," he read. "All prior arrangements that were made without full transparency are hereby revoked, and any assets, decisions, or authority assumed under those conditions will be subject to review and reassignment." There was no reaction at first, no immediate response, just a stillness that held everything in place for a moment longer than expected, and then Sophia spoke, her voice measured, controlled, but with an edge that had not been there before. "This cannot be right," she said, not loudly, but firmly, as if saying it would make it true. Daniel did not respond right away, his gaze fixed on the table, his thoughts moving somewhere deeper than the surface of the conversation, and I remained exactly where I had been, hands folded, posture steady, not because I was unaffected, but because I had already lived through this moment long before it arrived. Mr. Reynolds set the letter down gently, his eyes moving between them, but he did not argue, he did not explain, because the letter had already done that, and explanations are unnecessary when the truth is clear. Sophia turned slightly toward Daniel, her expression searching, expecting something, reassurance, agreement, support, but what she found instead was hesitation, and hesitation, in a moment like that, says more than any words ever could. I stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple, quiet movement, and for the first time, both of them looked at me fully, not as part of the background, not as someone to be acknowledged and then dismissed, but as someone they had not fully understood until now. I did not speak, I did not need to, because everything that needed to be said had already been said, not by me, but through the careful, deliberate truth that had been placed in front of them. I reached for my bag, lifting it calmly, and for a brief moment, I allowed my gaze to rest on Daniel, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that I hoped he would eventually recognize, because understanding does not always come in the moment it is needed. Sometimes it comes later, when there is nothing left to distract from it. And then I turned and walked toward the door, each step steady, unhurried, not as an escape, but as a conclusion, because there are moments in life when staying says less than leaving, and this was one of them. As I reached the door, I paused just long enough to place my hand on the handle, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers, grounding, real, and I realized something in that quiet second. Silence had never been my weakness, it had been my strength, because it allowed me to see, to understand, to wait, and when the time finally came, it allowed me to act without hesitation, without doubt. I opened the door and stepped out into the daylight, leaving behind a room that no longer belonged to me, and a version of myself that no longer needed to exist.